the question that we want to consider this morning is the second question of the larger catechism. The first question is very similar to what you have in the shorter catechism. What is the chief end of man? And that is an answer, at least in the shorter catechism form, that we're all very familiar with. The chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. The larger catechism expresses that a little bit more fully, but really very much the same. The second question, however, is not found in the shorter catechism. And it is very much an adult question. It asks, how doth it appear? That old English language. How doth it appear that there is a God? And the answer to that question, let me read it for you in case my memory fails me a little bit here. The answer to the question is, the very light of nature in man and the works of God declare plainly that there is a God, but His Word and Spirit only do sufficiently and effectually reveal Him unto men for their salvation. Now that might be a little bit longer than what you are ready for, and I assume that after reading it, you can't repeat it back to me right away. I even had to read it. But when you take a look at the answer to the question, how doth it appear that there is a God, you are impressed, first of all, with regard to the question itself, that it's a very modern question, isn't it? Though written back almost, over 400 years ago, it is still a question that people wrestle with today. How do we know that God exists? And so we didn't have to wait for Richard Dawkins to write The God Delusion to find out that there are questions with regard to the existence of God, or that intellectual people had problems in trying to understand whether God exists or not. This is a question that goes back into the time of the early Reformation, and clearly goes back well beyond that. You can go back into the ancient Greeks, and they also were asking these kinds of questions. You have the concept of the unmoved mover and these kinds of things discussed among the Greek philosophers. So this is an old question, but a thoroughly modern question. And it's also a very adult question. I said that the larger catechism really helps adults and trains them for service in the church. And this question in particular is one that adults will have. As you come out of those teenage years and enter into adulthood, quite often this kind of question comes to mind. How do I know that God really exists? I've been taught this throughout my infancy. I've been trained this way in my church. I've heard about it, that God exists. But how do I really know that there is a God? And so that question, particularly as you enter into your young adult years, sometimes impresses itself very significantly on your heart. And so you want to find an answer to that. The larger catechism tries to outline an answer for you. It does not explain everything. And as I'll make clear in a moment, it's not going to answer all of your questions in that regard. But it does provide something of a guidepost, a direction, with regard to how we can begin to think about this question. How doth it appear that there is a God? When we come to examine the answer of the catechism, we find that you can divide it up into two parts. In the first part, it talks about how God has revealed His existence in the light of nature and the works of God. And so these are very natural, if you will, external ways in which God makes His existence known to all His creatures. In the second part of the question, it focuses more directly on the way that God reveals Himself to His church in a way which is saving and effectual, which is unique and special. He does so by His Word and Spirit. And the Catechism divides these two means of revelation by saying essentially that the one is true and efficient for telling us that God exists, but on the basis of that knowledge, we will never enter into the presence of God and be saved. There's not sufficient information there to save us. We need a special revelation from God by His Word and Spirit. An inward spiritual illumination, which God must do within the heart, to open our minds up so that we can see and understand and recognize what God has clearly revealed in the world around us. Let's briefly take a look at these two aspects of this answer. And we'll begin by noting that God has revealed Himself through natural means in the world around us. The larger catechism talks about the light, the very light of nature in man, as one of the ways in which God reveals Himself to us. Now, in looking at that description, I found that that was somewhat puzzling. How do we understand the very light of nature in man in distinction from the works of God, which the confession will expand by explaining as creation and providence? Were they thinking of something different from God's works of creation and providence? Well, it's hard to go beyond the works of creation and providence. That would seem to encompass everything. But by talking about the very light of nature in man, the Catechism and the Confession focus on what God reveals to us in ourselves, in our very being, as to who we are in our makeup. We cannot even escape beyond our flesh and bones without discovering God and His existence. John Calvin opened up his Institutes of the Christian Religion with the comment that in order for us to know God, we must know man. And that might seem like a most unusual and perhaps a humanistic, even contemporary way of describing theology. But for Calvin, he recognized that God's revelation of Himself is not simply external out in the heavens above us, but it is internal, in the way that we are, in the makeup of how God has made us. We are created in the very image of God. And so by looking at ourselves, we see something of the God who made us. Our being made in God's image reflects the prototype, God Himself.